Welcome, everybody. It is my great privilege to be introducing today's event in collaboration with the Barbican Art Gallery and on occasion of the retrospective exhibition of Beatriz González, which is on until May 10th. So you have to see the exhibitions if you haven't already. I am so grateful to the exhibition curator Lottie Johnson and assistant curator Beatriz González, who first approached me to think together about an event to honor the work of Beatriz, who is lovingly known as La Maestra in her native Colombia, not only for her fundamental role as an artist across the 60 years of her career, but also as an educator, a curator, and a point of reference for countless artists across Latin America and beyond. Since we started organizing the event, Beatriz sadly passed away at the age of 93, surrounded by her family and friends. So today's event is even more than a discussion about her work's impact on our visual world, sensibility and personal politics, but it is a celebration of her life and her incredible achievements. Many of you will be familiar with the violence that characterized Colombian history, especially in the second half of the 20th century, since when González was a child. So the image that guided us in the organization of the event, which is at the bottom of the image on the screen, comes from two unlimited editions of posters from 1983, which reworked two newspaper images. The first, the frieze of comedy, which is the one to the right, is of outgoing President Julio César Turbay Ayala at an official ceremony. The second, frieze of tragedy, is of a former corporal who had murdered his friend's girlfriend and then committed suicide. As I am sure we will learn in greater depth across the day, this work is amongst those that mark a turning point in González's practice, when she felt that the irreverence and desecration that characterized her early work was no longer sufficient to portray the reality of Colombia. Across her work, then, we see and feel the interplay of tragedy and comedy, not as oppositional predicaments, but as two interlocked mechanisms of González's quotidian experience. What we will be exploring today is the possibility art offers to engage politics, but not by illustrating its events or by denouncing the wrongdoings of power, but by leading us to confront the irrationality of violence, to grieve, and to mind the staying power of injustice and violence. The event will begin today with a keynote lecture by Cecilia Fajardo-Gil, who joins us from Arizona State University, where she is Associate Professor of Museum Studies and Art History and Director of the Northlight Gallery. Cecilia is a Latina British Venezuelan art historian and curator of modern and contemporary art, focusing on Latin American and Latinx art. Fajardo-Gil has published and curated extensively on contemporary Latin American art and artists, and international artists. She was co-curator of Radical Women, Latin American Art, 1960-1985 at the Humour Museum, and Chicana Au ex-body at the Cheech Martin Center for Chicano Art and Culture in Riverside, California, amongst countless other exhibitions. Cecilia also contributed to the wonderful catalog for this exhibition. But beyond her astonishing professional achievements and her path-opening feminist scholarship on the work of women artists, Cecilia has been a figure of reference for me and someone who has always defended the ethics of curating that spills far beyond museum and university, in praise and criticism. I am grateful to be able to welcome her to the Courtauld today. Cecilia's keynote, just to do some housekeeping to prepare us for the day, will be followed by a coffee break. And then we will have a panel discussion with the curators of the exhibition, Lottie Johnson and Deborah Chocano, together with Rory O'Brien, Professor of Latin American Art, Latin American Literature and Culture at the University of Cambridge, and artist Amalia Pica. And I will introduce them before the panel, which will start at about 4:45. And before I end my introduction, I also wanted to thank the Research Forum team, Leila Bomba and Diego Arteche, who expertly guided us in the organization of this event and all the events here at the Courtauld, and without whom none of it would be possible. And I would also like to show my appreciation to the Center for the Americas here at the Courtauld. This is the symbolic structure that houses this event. And what it does is that it pushes us, who are part of the center, but the quarto in general, to push for a more complex and deep understanding of this region by answering a call to recognize the colonial and nationalist imperatives that have shaped the field and to bring to bear decolonial and transnational approaches. I will now leave the stage to Cecilia, and thank you all for being here today. And once Cecilia is finished, there will be a microphone going around for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sophia, for this introduction and for the invitation, and Lottie and Diego for inviting me to both write for the catalog and also for this talk today. And also is really nice for me because I am an alumni from the Quarto. I did 2 years. I did my MA when it was at the Strand, so it's coming back home. So I don't know, can you actually hear me? Yeah? Okay. So I hope to do justice to the work of an artist that had a career that spanned over 70 years, have worked all the way from her early 20s or the early 60s, all the way to her death. So she was relentless and powerful, and her work. And also, one of the things that I find incredibly timely of this exhibition, because it's always whenever you're confronted with historical work, because the exhibition goes back to the 1960s and it comes all the way to the nearly to the 20s, is actually to think, what does it mean, and also this is relevant for our history, what does it mean to look at historical work? And basically every single subject that is relevant for thinking about us as human beings is somehow touched by Beatriz González. She touches issues that have to do with violence, with societal injustice, political structures, and human tragedy, which are all so pertinent to how we experience the world today. This is a photograph of the artist. It's the closest thing that I could find of something that she used later on in her life to sort of put herself in the place of women who are suffering because of human tragedy. This is. So I don't have really time to cover every single stage of Beatriz's work, but I'm going to emphasize more works that for me mark the kind of really the main issues that have that are relevant for her work. One of the central things about Beatriz González is to think, what does it mean to be a political artist? And Beatriz González herself, many times in her life, she will say, I'm not political. I am political. I'm not political. She was always debating, and she was quite a contrarian person. So a lot of the things that sometimes we see in the work, she will say, it's not about that, but it is about that. So I think we need to probably approach the work of Beatriz González very much from the perspective of thinking of what does it actually mean for us, particularly. One of the things that I think that is most relevant of her work is the fact that she was so keen on seeing social issues in society. And this particular work, Los Suicidas de Cisga Suicide, which in the exhibition is presented by the 3 really main works in the series, is her looking at clippings of newspapers and how the image, by being presented again and again in the newspaper, became flattened. And this kind of flattening of the image somehow also transforms it into something which is almost kind of surreal and unreal, and the way she translates these paintings. And she's coming out in Latin America in the way that also happened in the US. During the Cold War, abstraction was a very important language. And Beatriz's early work is always figurative, but is always sort of somehow incorporating elements of abstraction. But here, what you see is in the way that the figures are represented, they're incredibly flat. Flatness is one of the great traits of ideas of modernity, and also has this kind of picture, planes inside the pictures. But basically, what is important is not only the fact that it is the painting it is, which is incredibly, I mean, she was an extraordinary painter, but is the fact of what it represents. She was from Bucaramanga, and Colombia has been a very religious country, and this is the way that this suicide was described is that they were a loving couple, but instead of consummating the marriage, because consummating the marriage means that she will fall into sin, they prefer to actually go into the Cisca Bridge and actually come to the destinies and die. So in order to do this, so this is a very extreme act. And Beatriz, from very early on in her life, she was very marked with the idea of death. And this is something that it kind of somehow follows the whole trajectory of her work. Another thing that makes her work really important is the way that she treated art history. So on the one hand, she had a great admiration for the great masters. I mean, here we have an example of Claude Monet, Women in the Garden, how she turns it into a painting called Be Cultured, Plant Trees, Give More Books from 1977. Again, the work is completely flattened, it's turned into something different. The chromatic palette of the painting also is different. But the main thing is that there is always this kind of tension in her works where she's really admiring the work by Claude Monet, but at the same time, she's also questioning the way that these European canonical works have somehow imposed themselves, you know, in a place like Colombia as some sort of, you know, the canon is something that you need to follow, you need to appreciate as a kind of the main rule. And so she is doing that, but at the same time, she's transforming it from a perspective of what she called the sort of third world country perspective or underdeveloped perspective, which also means in Latin America, there has always been this kind of tension. We are a colonized continent, but always since the early 20th century, there has been also this idea that how do we reclaim back also our cultural roots and a critical perspective from which we look at this kind of history we have inherited. And this is a very interesting case of that particular situation. And one of the ways that she does this, and she actually uses images of a company called Gráficas Molinari, which are supposed to be like kitschy images of, which in a way they represent canonical structures of thought, you know, the mother and baby and so forth, but they're done in a way that they're kind of digestible from a popular consumption. So she turns like these images, and she calls it Under Development 70 from 1968, and she turns it into Happy Days. The Happy Days is that. So again, it's this idea that we have to emulate this kind of classical idea of who we are. You know, we're white, and you know there is this woman with a sort of a clothes which is like a Roman of, you know, Greek toga, and then you have a classical column in there, as if it is very idealized, and women are in these roles of mother. So it is that, but then this woman is turned into this kind of brown, flat figure. The colors are clashing between them. There is very kind of an undefined way in which the figures happen. The other things that she did also was sort of take on Christian images, especially the image of the Virgin and baby is one of the ones that she repeated in many times. This is actually in the show. You see the Raphael Madonna della Seggiola, but she doesn't use the actual real work as a reference. She takes a really kind of cheap postcard of the image. So it's already an image that has been deformed from its original form. And then she turns it into this takes a vanity piece of furniture, and the reflection of your image of the vanity will be actually the Virgin itself. And it is both a way to sort of turn a classical work like Raphael already turned into something kitschy into an image which is also talking about how they percolate into our daily existence, you know, this kind of religiosity and this form of thinking maternity and the religious iconography. Beatriz, throughout her life, sort of refused to consider herself a feminist artist and to think of her work really from a perspective of gender, but gender is pervasive to all her work. She insisted a lot of on images and works in history and the role of women in society that really spoke about a position about gender that talks about that. Independently from everything, I mean, there is an incredible amount of irony in everything she does, and this kind of sense of humor. She's been thought as a pop artist, and she sort of also refused to be cataloged. Every single label that they've been trying to assign to Beatriz González hasn't really worked, and she would just say, I'm definitely not pop. And especially when we think of pop from a British or American perspective, is about consumer culture, and the way we understand the popular in Latin America is like literally what you would call popular culture, like the grounds culture. This is an image of a piece which is also in the exhibition, which is a lullaby piece, which again is a virgin with a baby and is in a cot. And the fact is that she would use this furniture, which is very cheap furniture you will find like in markets and so forth, metal furniture, and will paint with enamel. So both the material that she used for painting and the surface of the painting is not the traditional one in any way. And the way that you actually are, when you are confronted with this object, it is a sculpture, it is a painting, it forces you to kind of walk around it, look inside it, look down at the painting. That is a completely different way that you would have to think of a subject that's honorable as a, virgin or a maternity. This idea that you look down instead of looking up. There's always kind of symbolic ideas of how you can embody the experience of looking at her work. And the other one, for example, Leonardo da Vinci, the Mona Lisa, this piece is actually in the exhibition, is placed on this furniture. But you can see there is a photograph there of how she actually coexisted with that work. She will hang, her coat and have a plant on the bottom of the piece. So really this irreverence towards these kind of important icons in art history is incredibly important too. This is another piece. This is Botticelli. And then, so the Birth of Venus, basically she took this piece and she bought like a long piece of towel fabric, really cheap one, and then painted a Mona Lisa, which is quite distorted. But the idea to call it wash and wear, there is always this kind of criticism also, not only canonical ideas, but also the idea that idealized beauty is a huge weight on women, and the fact that, it's so pervasive in societies that the man, and then here you have, there will be another version here. For example, this is another one, 10 meters of Renoir. So there's actually two centimeters of this piece. Is it 2 centimeters in the exhibition? So there are strips of it. So Beatriz González not only would make these kind of monumental works, but then she would exhibit it in a gallery. Garcés Velázquez then will say, okay, you can buy it by the centimeter. So the piece would actually not have the integrity that it would have to actually mean something as a whole, as a painting. And this is such a famous work. I mean, the Quarto, cherishes a lot of this kind of history of impressionism. Dans les Moulins de la Galère from 1876. So again, when we think of painting, because she, painting, we've always thought of it as a traditional medium, and Beatriz was really intent of thinking of what she was doing as something that was really her own. Not because she wanted to be original in the way we understand that history, that in order to belong, you have to be unique, but in order because she wanted to have a voice of her own. And here is a exhibition view of the retrospective at the Museum of Fine Art. Again, you have the pieces of furniture coexisting with a very big piece of the Déjeuner sur l'Art, which is actually in the exhibition here. And it's interesting because, painting, we're not used to see painting as existing in furniture in this kind of large format that they form the original piece of the exhibition. The other thing she did is she had a lot of, she did a lot of ironical work about high society. And one of the subjects that she explored for a period of time was English royalty, which again, if we were to think of the idea of an upper-class taste, the royal family is very important. But, again, against the idea of refinement, what it is, there is an idea of crudeness. and flattening. The piece on the top right is of the honeymoon of Anna and Mark, and Prince Mark. And it turns out I didn't know this, but they actually had the honeymoon in the coast in Colombia. So for Colombian press, this was the greatest honor. So then Beatriz González took the pictures that came up in Cromos, which was a magazine that produced a lot of social images of the time. And there you have them flat. And, the smiles, when you look at the smiles in her paintings, they're always so grotesque and absurd. There is none of the sophistication that you would expect from this kind of polite, type of photograph that is the origin. One of the things that is really important to think about Beatriz González was looking at the cromos. At one point was looking at the history of art, but also then started to look more and more at images coming from newspapers, magazines, and so forth. So there is always something that Beatriz González is kind of having a conversation and a point of beginning in order to do her own images. And here, for example, another thing, I partly Venezuelan. In Venezuela, Simón Bolívar was the liberator of both Venezuela, Colombia, what you call the Gran Colombia, Ecuador, Peru. So Bolívar is a very revered, national hero, whatever translation. He is originally from Venezuela. But again, he takes the origin of the image, which is actually in history books, and I studied with those history books, so I know that image really well myself. But then she already uses something that is a popular rendering, which is not the typical heroic painting that you would have in classical type of history painting, and then turns it into this a piece such as this, which is made, it's kind of bent and is metal and is, again, not very reverent in terms of what it means. And here again, you have a different version of wash and wear, which is the image on the right-hand side is a small little tower. When this exhibition, in which I was the co-curator, traveled to Brazil, we couldn't actually borrow the piece wash and wear, so we had a smaller version. And then we have so this is, we are already now coming into a moment in the history of Beatriz's painting, where she's beginning to look very deeply at the kind of political situation that is happening in Colombia. And in this case, she's looking specifically at Julio César Turbay Ayala, who was an important politician that was in power from 78 and 82. And this is a television where he's announcing the arrival of color TV in Colombia. But all of these images, and on the right-hand side, you have an image by Clemencia Lucena, another Colombian artist who was very ironical also of the sort of high society in Colombia. And again, she turns beautiful images of weddings in the newspaper into these really grotesque expressions of. So here, this is a very important work in the history of Beatriz González's work, Decoración de Interior, interior decoration, where she actually paints. So this work is actually printed in a shop, and is 140 meters of painting. And this is actually based on this image that you see at the bottom. César Turbay Ayala had actually a personal photographer that took a lot of pictures of his social, situations, going to the birth parties, commemorations, and so forth. It was a kind of a propaganda, because at the same time, during his political period, there was an incredibly repressive, there was a lot of violence, there was a lot of torture, etc. So it was really kind of a big distraction. It was fairly grotesque and circus-like. So she is really, and when you see this, and if you get to see it in person at the exhibition, you can see the smiles are incredibly empty and grotesque again. The expression becomes, and also this fact that this multiplication again and again of this image that becomes kind of sameness is like a seriality in the work of Beatriz González doesn't work as a dilution of an original idea. It becomes always like a magnification, and this idea of banality and corruption, and hypocrisy versus the idea of the violence that was actually taking place at the time. And again, you can see how she uses a photograph from the newspaper to turn into those monumental piece, and people just came to the gallery and bought it by the meter. So this is an image from the exhibition, which I like so much because, again, you have the superposition of Turbay Ayala on the TV, then you have there was a part of the curtain that was not painted in colors, it was in black and white, and then you have all the objects, because the surface that Beatriz González used was so multidisciplinary in a way. And here is the piece that Sophia already described. Again, this image is actually the piecing together of two different moments. One is a couple, so ex-military killed the girlfriend of her friend and then committed suicide. Beatriz González had an incredible archive of the most gruesome images you can possibly imagine. She was very brave to do that. I mean, when we were working on the catalog, these images are relentless, and I decided to spare you the having to see them. But again, you know, you have this conflation of this sort of moment of the social tragedy, the endemic tragedy in society, but also this endemic violence has a lot to do with gender. Women are always at the receiving ends of violence. And then you have this, you know, this, I understand that the commemoration of this was done through a law that was passed that had to, caused by, of authors like Gabriel García Márquez, had to go on exile. So, and I just wanted to show that Beatriz González was not alone at the time. There were other artists like Deborah Arango, who Beatriz González really admired, and she was one of the first truly political artists in the country. In this case, this, you know, the way she presents kind of political corruption, and she was working during a time called La Violencia, which is the period before the period that Beatriz González concentrated. The Colombian conflict lasted between 1964 and 2017, but the Colombian dictatorship and La Violencia was between 1953 and 1957, and there was a particularly horrible dictator at the time called Gustavo Rojas Pinilla, and so she's constantly talking about this idea of the republic, of the constitution, and turns the politician into this kind of animal-like creatures, and you know, you always see kind of death surrounding. So, and then you have someone like Nirma Zárate that was very particularly sensitive to the sort of the social conditions of poverty, and she did these works which were concentrated on children in the streets. And then you have Sonia Gutierrez, Seguiremos Diciendo Patria, we'll keep saying homeland. There was a very strong violence against young people, especially students that were protesting against dictatorship. And these are images based also on the newspapers and news, where you will have people hanging upside down, and once a day or whatever, they will hang them upside down, and they will have to say, you know, things like Moriremos Diciendo Patria. And then you have other artists like Clemencia Lucena, who became a staunch communist. And then you have Maribela Marmolejo in 1981. She did this performance called Anonymous One, where she dressed up in white and cut herself in front of the public, and then also healed herself. But people were very shocked by the fact that they could see the blood. And then she was saying that, you know, for her, what was really difficult was that there was this incredible violence going on in the country, and people were not really paying any attention. And the fact is that whenever we really truly expose personally to violence, we react in a very strong way, which was the case if you see the faces of people that couldn't really stand the sight of this. So these are other artists that from Colombia that were, but there was a particular moment of inflection in Beatriz González's work. So her work moved from being ironical and having this very kind of acid sense of humor, and to look at politicians, sort of, she was already kind of denouncing a sense of corruption, but Beatriz González, one of the interesting strategies of political artists was that she never really took a position. If you look at Clemencia Lucena, she was a communist, that's it. No, Beatriz González showed everything from each side. You know, she was showing both the, the victim side and the military side. So she was kind of really encompassing from that point of view. But what happened was when the Palace of Justice siege, it was a terrible moment that was shown in TV where they tried to take on the Palace of Justice M19, and the president at the time, Belisario Betancourt, decided that instead of letting them and negotiating in any way, decided to simply light a fire in the palace. And more than 100 people died, and it was not just the people that were there trying to, claim against the government, but also justices and civilians. And that really was a very difficult moment. And the images that exist still today of that, that there was, and often it happens in sort of situations of violence that a lot of innocent people die in the crossfire because it's a war of powers. And then here is an image of 40 years later, because the problem is there was never really a true moment of apology or anything. So it's an unresolved thing for the people that actually lost loved ones. And as a result of that, Beatriz González decided that she could no longer continue to simply be an ironical artist, that she needed to be an artist that denounced what was happening in the country. And she produced these two paintings, one in 86 and one in 87. The first one, Mr. President, what an honor to be with you at this historic moment. You can see the president in front of a charred body. And, Beatriz was very interested in the way she created always these kind of complex theaters of situations. Hardly ever she would represent the moment of violence itself. She would normally focus on the consequences of violence. And so here you have the presence of the president, you have this kind of giant hands, which is very mysterious on the top. It's like a powerful situation, but it's like nothing is happening. And then when you have the image, done 1 year later, the body is replaced by these flowers. You have the military, at the top of the image, flanking the whole situation. So we understand that this is an image about power. And then the expression of the people in the paintings, the politicians in the paintings become more obvious. And then she did paintings such as this from 1987, Los Papagayos, the parrots, which is an image based also on this clipping called La Escuela de la Guerra, where there are, some of the strongest politicians of the time are there. And again, she reproduces, sort of serializes this idea. And then I wanted to pair it with an image that comes a few years later, which is Retratos Mudos, Mute Portraits, which is a photograph from the press, which had to do with drug cartels. One of the things that is important to know is that Colombia's violence is incredibly complex. You not only have periods of dictatorship, military power, you have political power, you have the paramilitary, you have the drug cartels, and you have social violence. So it's, and I think she will just say that it was very difficult to talk about violence and about pain in such a way, and try to really capture what that really means. And that's why, when you bring together a lot of the paintings, you realize that she was really portraying a lot of this kind of insistent, this kind of increscendo of violence that continuously was, and because she uses these kind of serialized, this sort of, it's not just one person, it's several people, then it becomes a story that is really kind of completely unavoidable. This is Beatriz González in her archive in 2001. You can see all the clippings, and really, and the interesting things, and she looked again and again at these images. And also, by this moment, she's beginning to think of certain images, and she inserts them in paintings in a completely different situation. But it somehow, by creating a collage of images that come from different painting is a way of creating an accumulation of this kind of complex notions of pain throughout her work. I mean, for example, Catalina Izquierdo, sorry, this is actually the wrong date, it's 65. This is a painting that is it 85? Oh, okay, it's 85, okay, but the image originally was from early on, it's actually 69, okay, exactly. So she inserts these really gruesome images. This is an old man that was found all hacked to death, but she inserts the body into what she calls a gobelin, you know, like the French idea of a tapestry. And then also there is this painting of a woman that had been murdered, a prostitute that was murdered but was never identified, and she uses this anonymous image again and again. And from this point of view, I think when you look at what you may think of historical paintings or something like that, you would normally see a history which is told by the victors, and Beatriz González definitely did not do that. She actually really represented a lot of anonymous figures in order to stand for a collective memory. And, you know, because why bother to create several works around a prostitute that was assassinated and nobody knows who she is, or Catalina Diaz Izquierdo, just an old man, you know, found, you know. And here you have, I wanted you to see, in this image, you have here on the Apocalypse, Camouflage Apocalypse from 1989, in one part of the painting, you have both at the bottom of the painting, you have the image of Catalina Diaz that is reproduced, and then you have the motif of the stag from the blanket that was in the painting of Catalina Diaz expressed here. And there is, which is really nice in the exhibition, there is an image that she looked at the luchador libre as kind of a strong bodybuilder type of figure, which is lurking in the background. Then you have a kind of a military figure. And this was also proposed on an image of a house that had been blown out or be completely broken. So by collapsing these different moments in time and different photographs and different realities, really it becomes a kind of it creates a complexity that does not allow you to simply pin it down specific, but at the same time, it really speaks about something much more complex than that. And at the bottom, cover him, this was about the death of a Chopo. I mean, if you look at the different moments in history, the era of the cartels in violence in Colombia was particularly terrible between 80 and 89. You know, they would assassinate the Minister of Justice, you know, and so forth. So basically, the drug cartel became like a very, very important, you know, between the paramilitary and the military, the drug cartels were in the middle, also exerting pressure and killing political figures. And so at some point, you know, when they killed a lot of this one, the Chopo was a particularly brutal. I mean, I remember from my days who the Chopo was even before I knew about Pablo Escobar, because he was a kind of a violent arm that would kill a lot of people. So this painting again talks about that. And at the bottom of the blanket, you can see the motif again of the stag that comes, you know, across from the Catalina Diaz painting, and then again is an interesting painting because, you know, you have everything is kind of cropped in a way, and also you have the leopards. El Chapo had also like a zoo. This is a thing that happens with a lot of kind of rich, strange people, that they have zoos of them. And then you have like a foot coming out, and you can see the palette that she used is kind of weird yellow contrasted with this sort of turquoise, which you consider to be one of her big colors, and is a color that functions a lot as a standing for death, you know, sometimes. So again, there is no perspective. It's a completely dislocated, to talk about really the kind of dislocation of history and human life. This was a moment of hope, La Constituyente of the new Constituency Assembly. Again, you know, you have a lot of political fear. I spent a lot of time trying to assemble who was who, to see who was present at the time and so forth. And again, she represented, you know, it is clear that you have the main, you know, Gaviria was the main politician at the time that was part of this process, but the reality is that not not much changed because the conflict continued to exist. And then you have, as history becomes more and more violent and more images are in the press, and Beatriz becomes more and more sort of in a way empathetic, because one of the things that characterized her early work was a kind of a sense of ironical distance, and that allowed her a lot of leeway to be able to be playful and so forth. But there is no longer this, as the work becomes more and more ingrained in this kind of violence, becomes more and more sort of, she becomes more involved with the idea of grieving and the people who are grieving, and women are always at the center of this grieving. And that's one of the things that I find always very touching about her work, is that women occupy this kind of center stage, because women are normally also the ones that express most profoundly, for example, a moment of sorrow. And again, this is another person that was assassinated, the daughter of an important politician at the time, and you have the daughter and you have the crying women on the sides. So, and you can see here the image of the newspaper that she actually saw, the daughter reaching out for one last time to touch the face of the father. And then you have here, another painting from 2000 about, it's called Pain. Again, women grieving on the coffins of dead people. And because, so for quite a while, a lot of the war was actually sort of happening away from the city during the take of the judiciary building. Then it became both ingrained inside the urban environment, but also outside. And in the countryside, there were all sorts of tragedies happening, not only, the paramilitary burning villages, the military, it really is a history that is so incredibly relentless. And then, for example, in this painting, Contrapeces, Counterparts, you have again, and this is actually taken by a photograph where they're pulling out a body out of a mudslide, but she places this here in the context of floating dead bodies in the river. This is still the case in Colombia, the Rio Magdalena, or these rivers where, bodies are abandoned and they just float. And then you have, it's almost like a cinematic effect of the top, and mothers grieving again and again, and then you have the cross floating and the body, the images of religiosity are here. So if you can see on the photograph on the bottom, there is a photograph from 1979 where there was a huge flooding in the Magdalena River, and she focuses on this image on the right-hand side. There is an indigenous person in a canoe floating, and she's looking back at, or the person is looking back at the camera that is taking the photograph. And she uses this motif of this rower to actually be present in a lot of the paintings that she paints afterwards, not only to be a kind of an element of testimony, but also to talk about the fact that indigenous people and peasants were so affected by what was happening at the time. And again, the irony of that painting that you have on the right-hand side, you have a floating body is fully clothed, and then you have two women that seem to be sunbathing or bathing in a pool, and then you have the indigenous rowing looking back into the scene. So this is, again, this kind of incongruous experience of violence at the time. And here we come to a series which is incredibly important in her work, which is called Las Delicias, that she did between 96 and 98. And it really related specifically to an attack on by the Colombian military to a military base called Las Delicias. The FARC attacked the base, and 60 people died, and quite a few of them were made prisoners. And so this generated a lot of images in the press of people, of women weeping because of what had actually happened. Because, the violence in Colombia, you never knew what was happening. I mean, I know this also through Colombia. You know, if you were indigenous, you will be caught between the military and the guerrilla and so forth. So, so you have a woman here. You know, this gesture of actually covering your face is a gesture that will become like a leitmotif of expression of a sorrow that is impossible to express. You know, you just, and then here you have women, you know, and then again you have the indigenous person floating here, and here you have this, again, this photograph was a photograph that Beatriz González represented again and again as a drawing, as painting, as a basis for her painting. And for example, here, you know, the civil population, the tears of the woman actually float all the way down and fill all her dress, which is such a touching image. You know, as the water is contained and then you have the landscape. It is a completely desolate situation, and there is like a pool under her feet, which you don't know if is actually a river or lake, or a lake of tears. And I feel that this moment in her work where she identifies so profoundly through this image of sorrow, you know, there is just no, it's just no longer possible to, you know, this is a moment where Beatriz really feels that what is after this, you know, because, you know, there is always somehow when you are talking about difficult historical moments of violence, there is always like an after this, but this was like a moment where everything seemed to be lost. And Beatriz herself actually did a self-portrait, which is in the exhibition. It's an incredibly touching work. I mean, her whole body glows as it was really the body of a decaying body, and is not a flattering, it's not a flattering spectacle. And she's standing on a pedestal. She used, for this series of painting and others, also these curtains that are at the top, and it becomes like a theater, but it's also a theater that has to do with the home, and it has to do with life, and it has to do with being the center of attention. And again, you can see the photographs that again and again are feeding into. So one thing that is really important so one of the things that Beatriz González realized, and I think this we can relate to, is that when we see a lot of images of violence, we become completely like indifferent. There is a point that we can't take it anymore. We become indifferent. It's just a repetition of something that becomes senseless. And Beatriz was really worried about the idea that we shouldn't forget. So how do you turn an image which you reject because of what it means and is forgotten? Because also, I mean, she created an archive of images, but these images, imagine you buy the newspaper, you throw it the next day. Now she insisted in not discarding them. And this translation into the idea of an image which is representing a fact into a painting that becomes an allegory. This, I think, is the power of what these images become. And also the moment where you stop representing another person, you become the subject. You become also this woman. She actually said, I am all the mothers together. So the idea of the individual and the collective coming together into her own body is, for me, incredibly touching. Here again, you have other images. There are different events. For example, in this event, these people have disappeared. So the coffins, actually what they had was photographs of the people that had disappeared. And usually in moments of war, whenever someone cannot claim a body, even if it's dead and buried, and do the ritual of, you know, conclusion, is actually incredibly difficult. It is a very important work that she did in 2007, between 2007 and 2009, called Obras Anónimas, which is in the Columbarium, the cemetery in Bogota, which had actually hundreds of bodies, many of them as a result of the conflict in Colombia, and that it was declared in 1985 as a monument that had to be preserved, but then you had a politician that decided that it had to be teared down, and she fought very hard with another important artist to save it, but eventually all the dead bodies were removed from each one of the but each one of the niches, yeah. So one day she was she was driving along at night and she saw all these empty halls, and she decided that that couldn't stand like that anymore, that you needed to save the auras of the people that had actually been there. So she decided to create this work which was based on these images. You can see this is one, but she collected hundreds of images of people carrying their dead bodies, with these kind of sticks and this kind of cloths. So there is hundreds and hundreds of these images that they were placed, and they were actually sealed, each one of these spaces in memory. And again, usually we celebrate the death of important people. I mean, often I looked at the breaking news in the newspapers, like such and such died, but this is literally celebrating hundreds and hundreds of lives of people that nobody, they were, the bones even weren't even preserved. And I think that is a really is an incredible gesture to do something like this, to really care for something and to say that we cannot forget something like this. These are some of the later images of, again, women that were provided with the remains of the dead relatives, and then there would be, they would have to bury them and so forth. So again, the fact that she was paying attention to this is so important. And this is an image from 2018. It's called the Mourning Frieze. And again, this is in Bogota, but again, they become this kind of repetition again of images of mothers crying. But this is very, very schematic. This is almost like a cartoon, like that it repeats itself, but to still want to do this. And this is not anymore the moment in which this is actually the most endemic problem in society, but the problem is there are things that haven't been resolved. There are a lot of people that are mourning. And I wanted just to bring in the images of the mothers at Plaza de Mayo, because Beatriz González actually was moved by these women who, having lost during the dictatorship in Argentina, a lot of the children, but most of the children were never returned to them. And some of them, these women are very old, they're still there asking for their, to know where the children were buried. They want to, have a sense of closure. And many of them will also disappear because it was so, they wouldn't hold back. They would just go there again, day after day after day. And some of them, especially the most prominent ones, they would disappear themselves for asking for the most basic human right. I wanted to finish my talk with one last image, which is from the exhibition of the Barbican now with Las Delicias, where you have 3 of these portraits of these kind of women and this idea of sorrow with her embedded into that. And I just wanted to say that when we, there's always been a lot of discussions about, is art capable of any change? Is art meaningful really in the face of violence when it can really produce real change in real life? But the reality is, when you look at the work of someone like Beatriz González, I mean, their work really stands for a memory that we shouldn't forget. And this memory, I mean, if we think of the world in which we live today, is meaningful for thinking of our own place in the world and how is important in order for us to be human. Every single book about totalitarianism, like Hannah Arendt or anybody, is always talking about the fact that we can become cruel and indifferent when we distance ourselves too much from pain and bad news and tragedy. And the reality is, unless we care, tragedy will will continue. It's not that we can actually probably sometimes do something, but part of our condition as human being is actually to hold space as a collectivity for other people. And I think Beatriz González reminds us that in such a powerful way. She didn't have a loss of a child. She wasn't a poor woman. She wasn't a woman affected directly by the conflict. She was respected as a person, but she used the power, the agency that she had to talk about this. And for her, she used to say that paintings can say, things that images and photographs cannot say, especially newspaper images, which are often sensationalist and they're not respectful of the pain of others. So I think, when I look at Beatriz's work, I'm reminded I'm a mother too, I'm a human too, and I need to be, need to hold space for what may be, the tragedy that other people are ongoing. And if I can do something, I should. But I do feel that art does have a role in that sense. If we look back, we don't need to read an encyclopedia of the history of Colombia to understand what those people have gone through, and they're still trying to come to terms with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for staying on. So for this part of, now we will begin our panel discussion, and I will introduce all the speakers, and then questions for each one, and we will see where we get. So I'll start sort of in geographical order. Cecilia, you have met already. Then we are joined by Amalia Pica, who is an artist who lives and works in London. She received her Bachelor of Arts from the Escuela Nacional de Bellas Artes in Buenos Aires in 2001. In 2020, she was awarded the Zurich Art Prize, which included a solo exhibition at Haus Konstruktiv in Zurich, Switzerland. And in 2011, she participated at the 54th Venice Biennale. Her works are represented in many major collections worldwide, and solo exhibitions include Museo Humex, Institute of Modern Arts, Brisbane, Australia, Kunsthalle Lissabon in Lisbon, Chisenhall Hill Gallery here in London, Malmö Konsthall in Sweden, and amongst many others. Amalia's words on Beatriz González also appear in the exhibition catalogue, and many concerns are shared across their practices. Then we are joined by the wonderful Lottie Johnson, who is a curator at the Barbican Art Gallery. And there she has thoughtfully and rigorously, I want to say, curated numerous exhibitions that I will not soon forget. Amongst them, Unravel, The Power and Politics of Textiles in Art, and Carolee Schneemann, Body Politics, as well as solo commissions by artists Sintra Samsita, Toyin Ohin, and Serafine 1369. Is that how you pronounce it? Sorry, Ito Barrada and Bedwer Williams. She has contributed to several other Barbican exhibitions and accompanying books, including Into the Night, Cabarets and Clubs in Modern Art, Basquiat, Room for the Real, and The World of Charles and Ray Eames. She previously worked at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and she is a regular contributor to exhibition catalogs, publications, and public programs on modern and contemporary art. And I think that if you have seen the exhibition, you will have seen that Lottie really is a researcher, I think, first and foremost. And the rigor of her research really shines through in her exhibitions. Then we have the wonderful Diego Chocano, who is assistant curator at the Barbican, which he joined from Tate Britain, and previously the University of Essex, which is actually where we met, and where he welcomed me numerous times with my students, both Courtauld and Cambridge, when working at the incredible Escala, which is the first collection of Latin American art in the UK, where I really always admired the way that the embodied knowledge you have of these objects, because the beauty of that collection is how you can really have this personal relationship to the object. And I think that really you carry that in your curatorial practice. He has curated exhibitions internationally in England, Scotland, Argentina, and Chile, and his writing was featured in outlets including Burlington Contemporary, Art Shock Revista, and Map Magazine, and in publications for major art exhibitions, including, of course, the catalogue for this show, as well as Unravel, the Power and Politics of Textile Art, and Foreigners Everywhere, which was the 60th Venice Biennale, which I had the pleasure of working with you on. And last but not least, where are you in my? We have Rory O'Brien, who is professor of Latin American literature and culture at the University of Cambridge. He has published Literature, Testimony, and Cinema in Contemporary Colombian Culture, Spectres of la Violencia in 2008, Latin American Popular Culture, Politics and Media, Affect in 2013, Latin American Cultural Studies, Arida in 2017, and Transnational Hispanic Studies in 2020. His current research focuses on Colombia's Magdalena River in the 19th and 20th century literature and history. And Rory's research has really been foundational to my thinking around the power of the popular in shaping the political unconscious in Latin America. So I'm really delighted to welcome you all to this panel. And I wanted to begin by reflecting a little bit on this wonderful exhibition and the experience of being in this exhibition at the Barbican. And I told you at the opening how upon entering the exhibition and seeing it, and it's one of the rare openings where I actually could not see the exhibition, I had to see it. I was not prepared for the sense of turmoil and disquiet that I felt walking through its very carefully curated rooms, which by all intents and purposes, I mean, upon an initial look, they are colorful, humorous, joyous, but the feeling that I had was very much the opposite of that. And while I really loved the way that you curated it, I really felt that in each room, the voice of Beatriz González was really present. So the way that you organized the exhibition really was around her words, around the direct quotes that are sort of printed on all the walls. So you really feel like the exhibition is guided by her, and there is this real presence of La Maestra in the rooms. Of course, she was very outspoken, as we've heard, a very powerful character. And she had full command of her intentions in making her art. And this is really conveyed in the way that the show is curated. And above all, her presence is felt, but above all, her own emotional turmoil, her moral imperatives, her thought processes and decisions, her grief, and this awareness of mortality are really spoken to us, I feel. And the tension between the denial of humor and the pragmatism of tragedy, and that's kind of raised in my brain, I felt incredibly strongly. So the disquiet I felt, I think, really describes, and this is how you also concluded your talk, Cecilia, a sense of solidarity with her, but also with all victims of violence, not necessarily just in Colombia, but really everywhere. And I felt connected to strangers in grief, which is a sentence that also appears in the catalogue. And I wanted to sort of start by asking you to tell us about how you approached this very difficult curatorial project and what the greatest challenges have been.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for all your generous words about the show. And it's a pleasure to be with everyone on this panel. I think it's really beautiful that you end with that idea of the strangers in grief together, and also how you ended your keynote, Cecilia, because actually that's the starting point for the reason for doing this show, was that I had first encountered Beatriz's work through the work that maybe many of us first encountered her through the furniture works that are so brilliant and sardonic and full of humour and wit, and take on these legacies of dominant Western art history and playfully think about how they've been transformed when they land in Latin America. So that was my entry point to her work, and actually I first encountered the work, strangely, here in London at Tate in 2015 in the World Goes Pop show. And then, of course, seeing the breadth of her work. A few years later, I saw her work at KW in Berlin in a retrospective that was traveling around Europe, and it was then that I was so struck by the works from the 80s and 90s and this just complete emotive and visceral contending with the emotional impact of grief and mourning and loss that we are bombarded with every day through the media. And I found this very kind of palpable personal connection with thinking about a history that I knew nothing about, the history of very complex violence in Colombia, and thinking about my own experience every day of opening the newspaper, looking on my phone, being just bombarded by these images and asking myself to contend with, what do I do? How am I implicated? How do I act in response to these images? And she has, of course, been doing this, in fact, since the 60s, not just from the 80s, when we often talk about this turn in her work, but the violence is there, or the interest in violence, as you talked about, Cecilia, is there from the beginning. So I guess one of the challenges of the show was how to bring together, this narrative of this switch in the 1980s, so this turning point where she is kind of committed ethically and morally to bearing witness to violence. And it's such a clear shift that she talks about so explicitly, and you can mark it so clearly in her work. But what I think we wanted to do from the beginning was show how actually this has been a concern from the very start, from the 60s, when she's taking these images from the newspaper, turning them into these extraordinary prints, these very cheap, readily reproducible heliographs, this form of blueprint technology where she's taking images of assassinations, murders, thinking about how she is consuming these images alongside adverts for how to heal tonsillitis, or a wrestler, or a kind of competition at a wrestling gym, and thinking about all these images from popular culture and violence and how to contend with them together. So I guess it was about how to stitch that narrative together, but make sure that those concerns of contending with grief were embedded from the very beginning of the show, and that it wasn't just this kind of easy narrative of this sudden turn in the 1980s. One of the challenges. I don't know, Diego, you want to speak to other challenges?
I think, also the fact that she, something that Lottie and I talked about a lot throughout the process of making the exhibition was that she is, like an icon in Colombia. She's very well known. She's extremely respected. And not just in Colombia, across Latin America. She also had retrospectives in the US. So she's someone who has been successful almost from the outset. She had her first solo exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in Bogota when she was about 32, I believe. So respecting the fact that she is this, absolute icon in her local context, but that we would also be introducing a lot of UK audiences to her work for the first time. So we wanted to be very careful not to frame the exhibition as a discovery of this forgotten artist, because that is far from the case. And similarly, I think something that we found not challenging, but that we knew we would have to be very, very careful about in how we talked about the work and how we talked about the context within the work was made, and our interpretation was, Colombia's history is very complex, very particular, very long in terms of its conflicts and the violence that has occurred there. We wanted to make sure not to paint Colombia as this place where there's only tragedy, where there's only violence, where it's essentially like this narco state. We wanted to make sure that we didn't flatten its culture and its history in that way. Equally, we wanted to make sure that our audiences were aware of the histories of violence that she was responding to. So a lot of the time, particularly in how we wrote about her work and the histories that her work respond to, it felt like, walking, I think walking the tightrope is too much, but we wanted to be really, really careful and put a lot of thought into that. So I think that was another challenge that we faced, of many. There were lots of challenges.
And I like how you picked up on how we used her voice as the kind of guiding narrative for the show, because that was very intentional, and we talked about that a lot, about the challenge of working with an artist who is at the end of their life and knowing that she might not be able to be with us here in the UK because even obviously we couldn't predict when she was going to pass away, but she was not very well in the last months of us working with her. So it was so important to us for her voice to be the guide. And she was an incredible, I mean, we haven't really talked about this yet, but she was an incredible teacher, curator, art historian, writer about her own work, about other artists. She was an expert in the history of caricature. So she was this extraordinary scholar, and her use of words was so precise, specific, decolonial before its time. You know, she talked about herself as a provincial artist from an underdeveloped context, making underpainting. You know, she used these words with such precision and self-consciousness, and so we wanted to bring those words to life in the show. And yeah, it's very important to us for her voice to guide us.
Thank you. That is so inspiring and beautiful. Also really challenging, as you were describing, to come to terms with such a giant figure. And there is everything in this show. There is sort of the history of art. There are Cold War politics, gender-based violence, issues around religion, patriarchal culture, popular culture, indigeneity. Everything is in this show. So like very difficult to decode it in a way that makes sense. Which kind of brings me to my question for Rory, and also about the show. I feel like a lot of the shows and a lot of the narratives around Beatriz González always start with the Suicidas del Cisca. It's really charged and sort of talismanic work within her practice. And I noted down one of the quotes about that work, which is, it amazes me how fast people forget the images from the news. The way that I fight against or try to prevent the memories from disappearing as fast is to use the images in my work. The process culminated in a work with a popular character, a monument, but an ephemeral one. So here in this sentence, what really struck me and what I really think is at the core of her practice, and in fact, I came to it via pop, which I can see, I mean, it is a very contested avenue through which to get to Beatriz González. But the notion of the popular and the popular character is something that is very important. And so how I'm reading it is that she wanted to harness what was popular and appealing as a way into the home somehow. And so I wanted to ask Rory, kind of what was Beatriz on about, in your opinion, when she's talking about a popular character, and what is the force of popular culture in Colombia in your experience?
That's $1 million question. Okay, I'll do my best. Actually, can I just say something about my experience of that gallery? Can I say something first?
Yeah, of course.
I usually hate going to art galleries. I find them awful. I hate going to art galleries because I just feel kind of this trepidation. I walk into this space with all the, this is a place where sort of middle class people reproduce their social know-how and they flaunt their cultural capital and so on. And I always feel like someone who's a bit unwashed when I go in there. And especially in Bogotá's Museo de Arte Moderna, which for me is this sort of very aseptic space in this center of Bogotá, wonderful, bustling center of Bogotá, and I spend most of the time wishing I could get out and into the car park outside where there's a fantastic, amazing popular market. And I always think there's much more culture in the car park than in the gallery. But experience it, and the layout of the gallery, I think, is really similar. So there was a kind of uncanny effect that happened. And then I started walking around, and I just immediately felt very at home because it's the humour is extraordinary. I think it's not satire, it's not critique, as you say, Cecilia. I think very beautifully. It's not. She's not degrading those. Even when she's iconoclastic, she's not degrading these either the kind of popular cultures, or even necessarily those, well, she is actually, the kind of elite political classes. Anyway, at first I felt this sense of enclosure because you've got this dimly lit upstairs space, and it's all about interiors, isn't it? You've got the work of artists that sort of gravitates around these, the muebles from the 1970s, and this sense of multiple layers, right? You get the sense that there is this impression of the popular, which is multiply mediated through these, first reproduced, graphicas, newspaper pictures, then in her early work, she's copying, tracing, reworking, reducing, abstracting. But there's always this sense of the popular, isn't there, in the work. And then as you go round the exhibition, I cease to feel the nostalgia for the car park, because you get this kind of opening out. And I think that speaks to what Cecilia was saying about there is a kind of rupture, right? The mediations don't go. There's a constant, this is a constant, I think, in that work, this sense of there being, to use a slogan from 1940s Colombian politics, there's el país político y el país real, right? The political country, which is very small. It's a very, very kind of incestuous clique. And then there's this other nation, right? And after 1985, I suppose, the curtain's torn, the facade is literally smashed open. And then throughout the 80s and the 90s, you get the Constituyente, which of course produces its own kind of farce. The Plumario Colombiano, and then even including the kind of post-peace kind of reconstructions, this embrace of a pluricultural Colombia, the feathers on the heads, everybody's now kind of a neo-indigenous, and so on and so forth. That's something she anticipates. Anyway, there's a kind of opening out there, which I thought was amazing. But there's a sensing of the popular, I think, which leaves its mark on her work. It's not easily accessible. It's not a botero, where there's actually, it's something about that work. It has no irony. It has no real sense of the brilliant thing about her treatment of the popular is that she can capture the language of the popular, and she can capture the hijacking or the feeding by a mass-produced kind of popular culture and bring them together. I think it's what Adorno would call a kind of total social work, right? Somehow there's a two-way traffic between popular popular expression, popular signature. There's also an immediate kind of counter-argument or kind of force within the work, which gestures to the hijacking, the reproduction, the transformation of that art into furniture or decoration. So that's something remarkable, absolutely remarkable, the way she captures the signature, the style, the aesthetic style of a popular culture, and at the same time captures the tinned, serialized, mass-produced, the shite that they feed people in Colombia, produced by Dubai, the kind of telepolitics. And the way she does a double framing of that, which I think is really, really unusual. So I felt like I got to the car park before I'd left the room. And I also felt a kind of uncanny sort of sense of being at home, because I've been adopted for the last 30 years by a kind of lower middle class family. And they have all of these prints, the Gráficas Molinares, the slightly squiffy, slightly off reproduction of La Virgen de la Cédula, right? Beautifully rendered in that joke as the Virgin of the vanity seat. so clever. But I felt there's familiarity with that. But there's something remarkable, I think. But to put the popular is, she captures the lo popular as an expressive popular idiom, and she captures its capture and its and reabsorption and thingification by, let's call it, those in power. So that was a bit long, wasn't it?
No, but it's great. Well, I think this is really, I mean, to me, this is a lesson that needs to be crystallized somehow in how she makes art. Because you were saying before how she was against indoctrination. So she didn't want to tell people what to think or what to feel, but she wanted to participate or engage in a very simple way. But the way that she does it is through the popular, by somehow engaging in that dynamic that you just described between the mass and the folk and the vernacular and the high arts, wrapping it all around it. Yes, please.
Yeah, I don't know, because, you know, Beatriz González, I mean, she loved the idea of kitsch.
Mm.
And also, Marta Trava used to define some of her work about cursilería. Cursilería is like corny, which I don't think really properly defines the depth of what you're saying, which is this sort of really culture. We cannot think Colombia, we cannot think art without thinking of all these aspects of culture as broadly speaking. That's why also the idea of pop becomes limited from that point of view. But yeah, I don't know. So how do you, because I mean, I'm interested in your counter attitude towards art. Because, you know, ultimately, I
I'm
mean,
just a bit flat-footed. It's not that complicated.
no, because also when you think of, you know, for example, here you have the Virgin and whatever, and then
Mm.
it transforms into something. But at the same time, she really does love
Yeah.
the idea that Raphael will make such a work, or Guernica will make such a thing. So there is this sort of tension
Mm.
between the popular and so forth is actually really, really important. So I think one of the interesting things for me about Beatriz González, you cannot define her work by any single meme. You could not just go simply for the popular as such. And also, one of the things I wanted to say is that in Latin America, this division, which is so stark in Europe and in the US about high and low, is not such. There isn't such a big differentiation. High and low coexist. And I think Beatriz González was really a master in that sense of bringing this and collapsing them completely, entirely, and then embracing them instead of. And she used to always say that she wanted to make bad taste painting. So, but
To be a court painter like Goya, right?
it's
To
a
make,
court paint, like Turbaya,
to make them look
court
ugly.
paint.
The fancy people.
I have to say, I don't totally agree. I think in Latin America, the high and the low is even more present than it is here. Like that colonial wound is so
Festering.
and open, and these ideas of, oh, you can't do this because it's bad taste. Oh, you shouldn't do that. And she talks about how her mother, who she loved and admired dearly, would say like, oh, you can't wear this to your first communion because it's seen in very, very poor taste. And it's like the mark of Catholicism and the deeply classist society that colonized Colombia, Peru, etc. I've responded so much to those earlier works, the works from the 60s, 70s, where she's really thinking about taste and the high and the low, because I've experienced that in my family as someone from Peru, like, oh, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't like this, you can't, and for me, it's very, very embedded in.
No, I agree. Socially speaking,
Socially
that's
speaking,
the case.
yeah.
But I'm thinking that artists have actually rebelled
Mm.
against that idea. Because you know how in art history, let's say, I don't know, New York, you will just say high and low, you know, Alfred Bauer. But artists, I think, in Latin America really made a point that they didn't want to follow this kind of really strict division between high and low. But I think in society,
I'm thinking also that it is how we access the art
Mhm.
as Latin American artists. We access them through these reproductions,
Yep.
right? So our education, even already in the high of like art school or art institutions, was done cheaply, or it was done in the low, because this was pre-internet. There was like, I mean, I already am younger than Beatriz, and I also went to art school when there wasn't internet, and there was one art magazine that maybe we got to see every now and then, and all the reproductions were cheaply made. Like, so I'm just thinking, even in the way that you learned it, it was like especially if you're a Provinciano, like I don't think I saw an original painting until I was already in art school.
Yeah, and it's no coincidence that like this isn't just a reproduction. This is actually, if you come to the exhibition, it's a holographic postcard, which this image is not doing justice to. So it's like this kind of weird, sort of seasick version of Raphael's Madonna della Seggiola, and equally with the Last Supper. Yeah, one of the most famous paintings of the world that she turns into this dining table. Like it's this kitsch Graficas Molinari print in these psychedelic colours that people would have pinned up in their homes as an actual talisman to ward off burglars. And so many people have come to the show and looked at that. You know, we've got one of the Graficas Molinari prints of the Last Supper in the show and said, oh, that was in my grandmother's house. Like, this is an image that accompanied me through my childhood. And So yeah, she's interested in how they land and are transformed and flattened through this,
And
reproduction.
I think to your point, Cecilia, sorry, I think I misunderstood you. Like I about the high and the low within the art, I totally agree. And I think in the 70s, like height of the Cold War, I think a lot of artists at the time, I mean, if you read Marta Traba at the time, a lot of Latin American artists at the time were trying to find an expression that was, against U.S. neo-imperialism, to try and find a unique form of what is, a Latin American cultural expression or an expression in visual arts, which is something that Latin American artists have been concerned with since like the early 20th century, if not before, right? And so I think Beatriz turned to the popular and trying to replicate the faults of already faulty reproduction and exaggerate it in some instances to find a visual language that was very, very much uniquely hers. And I wonder, Amalia, when you were studying art, was there still that sort of like, what is Latin American art in your experience?
Yeah. Maybe, I don't know, because at that point for me the question was, what is art? It's like when you're an art student, we're like, what is this? But I guess when I was in art school, there was a 500 years exhibition in Brazil instead of the biennial, right? So there was a big sort of, what is it that we do? I think you have, at least for a while, when you're an art student, you exist on denial that you have actually never seen one of these paintings, like, right? Even now thinking about this, I was thinking about how I studied art history. I had photocopies of the book, black and white photocopies of the book. Like, I don't think I even, from some of these classical paintings, I don't even think I saw some of the color reproductions, because that's how we access them. There is definitely, and there was very much present, the question of what is Latin America, rather than what is Latin American art, right? That was a really important question. But at that time, when I was in art school, it was Brazil, right? The Brazilians were sort of the Latin American artists that we were looking at. So
Even though they used to say that they were not from Latin America.
Exactly. Well, the Argentinians like to say the same.
But that is definitely one of the things that I was also picking up on as something that you share with Beatriz, like this rejection of sort of an internationalism. And in fact, and paradoxically, I think the first time I touched your work was with this big group show about Latin American contemporary artists called Under the Same Sun, which had also an iteration here. And it started at the Guggenheim in New York, and then it was in Mexico. And so it feels like, how I wanted to ask how you continue because that I feel is a debate that was kind of circumscribed in the early 2010s. And now the situation has changed a little bit. And I'm wondering, how have you experienced that change and whether, but then I'll kind of go double question here. But then I also wanted to, another thing that we touched upon just now that really, I think, connects your practice to Beatriz is the non-didacticness of it. So you'd really enter historical topics and you engage with those fractures of histories where there are either obscuration or omissions or where sort of stereotypes kind of blossom and become entrenched. But then you completely avoid kind of telling, this is how it is. And there is this really core issue in your work, which I think really nicely complements the whole discussion around the popular in Beatriz's work, which is sort of form versus substance. And I wanted you to just talk about these things a little bit. Sorry, million-dollar questions here.
No, maybe I'll start by answering through how I see Beatriz's work rather than through my work, and then we'll see if we get to my work. But I was just thinking, or maybe also her attitude, because I think Beatriz González, and it's been interesting to discuss this show with also friends from here who are not Latin American or who went to see the show and sort of also wonder why, like, I think the thing about Beatriz González, and it's that everything, the importance of her figure is not just defined by her work, which is something that we know. She was an educator, she was a real presence, she created discourse, and I think she was very good at resisting being pigeonholed. And I don't know whether there's any other dignified way to answer what is it like to be a Latin American artist? Do you feel Latin American? How is it like to be a female artist? Do you feel like being a woman has influence? Like, these things are really hard to answer. And I think she just didn't, refused to be defined by them. And I think that has meant that rather than her work being, let's say, affirmative or a work that is sort of defined by identity politics, it's almost like the opposite of it. Yeah. It's like, that is why she did not claim indigeneity. She didn't, but she still was able to portray that pain. For example, I see her work and I see class in her work. And I see how she's been so smart about using her voice, using her privilege, depicting somebody else's privilege, somebody else's pain, without encroaching on that space in terms of identity. And I think it's because she refused to be defined. And that is why whenever she was asked anything, she just wasn't. She just wasn't a feminist. She just was not interested. That's not what she was doing. You know, and I think it maybe there were other ways, but I think she took one that was really smart. And I think I relate to that in as a sort of a way of being able to be guided by your interest, by the work that you want to make, rather than by and you know, in a sense, it's interesting that you mentioned Under the Same Sun, because I think for me, all these things, like the first question that you have as a young artist is, being called an artist is so weird. Yeah. You know, that's the first thing. It's like, when somebody says you're an artist, you're like, and then after a few years, you're like, I guess I am an artist, right? This is what I do for a living. I make artwork, so you accept it, and then eventually you're called a woman, or you're called a Latin American woman, and eventually you find yourself being that thing, and there's a point where you just sit with that discomfort a bit better, maybe. And I think with Under the Same Sun, for me, my case was very much that. It was like, well, you know, it's like, it's also Pablo Leon calling us Latin Americans. So it's like, if your brother says that, you know, like, I'm allowed to say I don't look good in this jacket, but you're not allowed to say I don't look good in this jacket. You know, like, there's this thing. And so you might take something that would feel like a strange jacket from somebody else. I don't know, yeah, sorry.
No, I think the discussion is really, really interesting. You know, I had a time in my life where I decided that I wasn't going to use anymore the term Latin America. Latin America was just a word that pigeonholed, generalized, created a thing. And then I discovered that if, let's say you have a department of, you know, modern art or a MoMA, and you have nobody that knows anything about Latin America, then Latin America disappears, because it has to be modern. And then, but no matter where you are, there is always a category that excludes something. Yeah. So if nobody is going to be specialized, I don't know, like Sophia, that has dedicated years in whatever, then the field doesn't, basically there is an absence. So after that, I decided to embrace back Latin America and consider it like a laboratory. And also, as an inheritor of a colonial attitude, we are constantly competing, Argentina versus Brazil, Colombia, whatever. And then instead of actually finding common grounds and not having the insecurity of seeing ourselves through a mirror of stereotypes and predetermination, I don't care about that anymore. You know, like, once I decided, for example, to call myself a feminist, I don't care what people think. Because basically for me, feminist is about standing by another woman and trying to honor the memory of other women and the work of other women. if people don't want to understand that, I don't care. So basically, there is a path in which we create, and I think Beatriz González was particularly ingenious about this because basically she wasn't a feminist, but she was a feminist. She wasn't political, but she was political. She wasn't this and that. And in the end, she did what the heck she wanted, yeah? So,
Which is her job. That was her job.
yeah, and then as curators, then we have to be brave enough, and as artists, to say, okay, I'm Latin American, and so what, and I'm a woman, and so what, and whatever. But ultimately, it's about the specificity of whatever language. And I mean, in contemporary art is about this kind of idea of the contemporary, and then it becomes specific by looking at Amalia Pica, who's an artist that is from Argentina, and is a woman, and what. All that informs, in a way, your practice. The thing is, this idea that we need to be cleaned up about all this, and then it becomes, that's why, I mean, Lottie did that I mentioned, and she participated in the exhibition on pop art at the Tate, The Wall Goes By. And that exhibition, I mean, showed the work with some sort of pink or whatever, bright orange walls. But she decided that it was important. I included her in Radical Women, and she was totally against me framing her work as feminist. Doris Salcedo said, absolutely not. I don't want to be framed with other women. And I thought, okay, you shouldn't deserve to be in the show. Beatriz, as part of her resistance, she would measure where it was important for her work to be, because ultimately we weren't pigeonholing women. So I think the fact that she was able to transverse all these subjects, all these ideas, and all these periods of time, and all this institutionality, I think is an example of how to exist in a world as a political being, as an individual, as a...
But also I think there is something to do with naming, right? Which is sort of somehow in a classical division more your job than my job, let's say, as an artist. But as an artist, it's like if you can't speak the object. So for the object to feel like, if you think about it really hard, there's no point in making anything, right? There's no point. It doesn't make any sense. So in order to make something that doesn't exist, you have to feel a little bit brave. And if you feel that it already has a name, that it's already been defined, then you lose this little bit of hope that propels you forward in thinking that you're making something that didn't exist before, right? So it's something that you can actually, and it is interesting because I feel like now there's a new generation of artists that are coming from identity politics into making. But I think Beatriz was very much from the other generation, which obviously she wasn't from the same generation as I, but I grew up as an artist with that idea that it was better if there wasn't a name before the thing existed. And then as it existed, you became more comfortable with naming it. I don't know if that, maybe it's too abstract, but.
No,
I mean, you have no control of the destiny of what comes into the world. Once you make the work, I think the important thing for art is not to be self-conscious. You can't produce within your mind thinking, if I'm going to be called a feminist or whatever. I mean, Beatriz González said, I don't care what you think. I'm going to do my work. I want to empathize with this and that. How we read it, that is beyond. And I guess as curators, you have this towering figure who is bigger than life, who is so knowledgeable and so fierce. And then you're trying to do something, and it's like, and again, you're speaking with, you're just not speaking to someone, you're speaking with someone,
Totally.
and then it becomes something different.
Yeah, and I think the kind of conversation around feminism is so interesting, and we touched upon this the other day, that when I first came to visit Beatriz, I was very open with the fact that I'm a feminist art historian and curator, and I'm coming at your work with my own experience, my own lens, but I also want to respect how you have considered yourself and understood your own work and the labels that you've chosen to reject. And I was explaining how I understood all of these female protagonists in her work and the women that appear from the 70s in all of these, masterpieces from art history with mothers and children, and how we can, read a gendered power dynamic in history through these works and how she's reclaiming them. And then also the later work in the 90s where she focuses on these women in grief. These are the women who are left behind. And I was saying to her, surely these reflect back these asymmetric power relations in society. And she was like, absolutely, they do. They tell us, my work is a mirror. It's refracting back the images. But I'm not a feminist. So it's like that label, and we were talking about this the other day, of like feminism as a very dirty word in Latin America in the 70s or the 60s when she was studying, growing up as an artist. And in some ways, it's quite a radical act to not take on that term, because you may have, like, she may not have gained the success as an artist that she would have. If she had claimed that term, she would have been disparaged. She might have been forced into a more of a political exile, like some of her peers had been. So I think there's lots of conscious decisions alongside this also resistance to didactic work, which she was so vocal about as well.
But hardly any woman in Colombia claimed that term, because basically feminism was an imperialist word. It was an imported thing into reality, and Beatriz González was very much a Colombian artist that was dealing with her context. And there was a very famous, I think it's 1983, a feminist kind of conference, and it was basically a huge clash, because women came to talk about Freud and about preconception and whatever, and then there were the women from the shanty town saying, we have no security, we have no water, we have, our human rights, we don't want to go against, we want to defend our sons, our husbands, and so forth. So there was a complete decision between this idea of a kind of a more bourgeois idea of feminism and the kind of activist women, the rights of women in society. And that division really was poisonous in Latin America. And I understand that a woman of her generation would not want to take it on.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Just like her quote that we put in the exhibition, that I did not want to be a lady who paints, when she was worried that she was getting too near to abstraction, which was the dominant mode of making, and which was, like, making pretty paintings. She wanted to make paintings against refinement, against good taste. I think, like Lottie mentioned in the context, I think maybe if you identified yourself publicly or whatever as a feminist, there was maybe a fear that you wouldn't be taken as seriously. And I think she was born the same year as Botero. Botero had an astronomical rise, and I think she might have felt like, why am I not getting the same? And then the flatness actually was, I think in part a response to Botero's volume as well. This is all to say, like, I wonder if she feared I won't be taken as seriously. And then there's also her relationship with Marta Traba. Marta Traba was so adamant that art shouldn't aim to indoctrinate, it shouldn't be didactic, and I feel this so much in Beatriz, in her art and her discourse. And then the last thing I wanted to say is very much like what you said, that once the art is made, you can't make art. I'm not an artist, but I can imagine you can't make art thinking about what is someone going to think. And I think of artworks more. You talked about how Beatriz called them mirrors. You can also kind of think of them as these signals, and one receives a signal and reinterprets that signal how they want to. Because for me, my approach to Beatriz and her work was more than through a feminist lens, through a decolonial lens, and I absolutely loved. My first in was thinking about how she was thinking about underdevelopment and using the word like subdesarrollo and third world in such a strategic and pointed and knowledgeable way as well. So I think there's so many angles through which you can read her work. It's so densely layered, and I think that's what is so powerful about it as well. Yeah.
I'm trying to think, who am I going to ask a question? Well, there is one, probably it's a quick answer. You were nodding so vigorously when we were talking about the Latin American pigeonholing situation. I wonder why.
I was just remembering a great quote from a Mexican writer. He says, being Latin American, it's a theme tune you sing to in Spanish and you charge for in dollars. Like a strategic, identification, isn't it? But this is, I suppose, you're writing about what it is to be provincial. It's actually she provincializes, this kind of map. You become a Latin American, you experience, as you said, a kind of an alienation that lops off a huge part of who you are. There are many nations that she doesn't like this thing, the nation, does she? Thinking back to your training as an Argentine artist, there's none of that national popular kind of costumbrismo. Is there any? No condors, no panpipes, no gauchos, no volcanoes, none of that stuff. There's a total, there's a distancing and a refamiliarization with this country that you've been to and you've read about, but it's another way, it's art. Art is a form of defamiliarization, isn't it?
And it's also a colonial concept, no? Like, that's the other thing. Like, Latin America is,
It's
like,
French.
there's not even, but there is not even like a word for what was there before that isn't described by the rapture, right? Pre-Hispanic. It's like pre-Hispanic. Like, there's not even a word still to
Can
define.
you come and
that.
give a lecture in Cambridge? Everybody's dancing around and talking about Abya Yala and wearing headdresses and spots.
Yeah.
And,
But also,
this is the problem. How do you undo?
Yeah.
You can't get away from this thing.
but one of the things that also for me I found it very funny is like often when people talk about Latin America, it says non-Western art. I think in what moment is non-Western art? Because basically the moment there was colonization and we were imposed, painting churches and bury the idols and so forth. And then there were moments at the beginning of the 20th century, there was anthropophagia. It was like Oswald Andrade created this symbolic moment where they said that they were going to, the Tupis had this idea of digesting the enemy, literally eating the power of the enemy. And so the symbolic thing was to absorb what they were interested about, what they had inherited from colonial times, what had been imposed on them, ejecting what they didn't want, and then reabsorb indigenous and African roots. So that was a very early moment in the 20th century where there was a symbolic, moment to say, okay, we're going to take what we want of what you've actually force-fed us, and we're going to reclaim again the things that we had to erase from our past. And then Torres Garcia inverted the map. He put the south on top and the north on below, and so forth. So there were all these kind of gesture of reclaiming, but we can't say unless he is Abya Yala and is kind of purely indigenous Yanomami art, Sharon Awe, for example, in Venezuela. But everybody else is like an amalgam of the most cosmopolitan art you can possibly imagine. I mean, there's nothing more cosmopolitan than Beatriz González.
Yeah.
She's contending with artists that nobody dares to touch. Guernica by Picasso, oh my God, and she's a woman just saying, I'm going to redesign this whole thing from my perspective. So it's very much this idea of empowering, this idea of the provincial, the specific, the Colombian, and celebrating this kind of hybrid kind of cultural condition. And I think there is nothing, how do you say acomplejado?
It's no complexes that.
That you have a complex of inferiority, that you have a complex, also the word third world, tercermundista, subdesarrollo, the way she was using it in its time was a time of empowerment. It was a time when there were all these movement of the colonial movements in Africa, Ana Mendieta was using the term. So these are not, when my students use subdesarrollo, third world, they use it like a dirty word. I'm saying no, but you need to think that in that context, it was an empowering word. It was an alignment. That's why Latin America, when we think about the solidarities, we have shared history between Colombia and Argentina and Bogota. So that's a much more interesting idea. Yeah, we've inherited a colonial history, and then we have a particular relationship with popular culture. We have histories of dictatorships and so forth. So why are we not having a conversation between us as opposed to say, I'm not Latin American like Brazilians did? We are that and we are much more.
Most of these decolonials know nothing about colonial history, and I think she does. And I first encountered her, they know nothing at all. They completely reinvented it through this schoolboy fable of sort of, there was the conquistador and then the colonizado. It's totally simplified, but she's not. I first encountered her as writing on history painting. It was extraordinary research into colonial history painting and 19th century painting. It was as a scholar, and what she does with the frames, the bed frames, just, there's a real attentiveness to history there as well, which can't be, wiped away with some decolonial gesture. So I'm not anti-decolonial in totem, but you can't get rid of the coloniality like that. You can't, it's not just a change of clothes. And
But you can't if you're painting, no?
No, not if you're painting. Yeah. But then one that says when you look at the objects and how they're reinvented and the signature left on those or on high art or how popular art becomes high art, Without the indio, mestizo, blanco, etc., then you see that what is this thing called colonialism? Looks like a hell of a lot more complicated.
And I think her playfulness with that is also, so I mean, you talk about the furniture, muebles, like she talked about the furniture, the beds, the tables as the frames for her work, and actually the frame reference was the gilt colonial kind of altarpiece frames that framed all of these amazing paintings of Catholicism, and that she had spent so much time in as a child, like going to these churches and seeing these altarpieces. And this was her riposte to the gilt colonial altarpiece, was these pieces of furniture. Those were her frames. So knowing and
Stunning,
yeah.
The frame, there are multiple frames, aren't there? There are at least 4 or 5. There's the reframing of, say, La Suicida del Cisca or La Gioconda. Another frame which is the framing of that copy within a certain style. And then she'll include things like the little corner places that suggest that this is actually in a family album somewhere. And then that frames you socially looking at those, like here, for example. I mean, so there's this proliferation of frames that do something to the relationship between the spectator and the artwork. You can talk about the bedsteads better than I can. There's something
The final image you showed, the self-portrait, and then you pointed out the theatre curtains in the back, I think, are really...
Do you talk about art and like design in art history? Because I thought, are these supposed to be never mixed, art and interior design? Because that's a current throughout.
Also, that is where the wallpapers come in. We haven't discussed the wallpapers, but it's she got so into it in the later work.
And maybe
But also selling the art by the meter, by the centimeter,
exactly.
selling art history or the political history of Colombia.
La oferta del siglo. Everything is commodified.
The name of one of her solo shows was La Oferta del Siglo, the offer or the deal of the century. But speaking of this art versus design and how the two often don't intermingle, like an anecdote that we were talking with Cecilia about today was about, if you go back to the wallpaper, the Plumario Colombiano,
It's fantastic.
I mean, you can...
It's pretty.
Lottie and I spent hours thinking about whether it would be kind of sacrilege to hang that painting on the wallpaper because it's a work of art. How are you going to hang a work of art on top of another work of art? And we spent so much time racking our brains, and then ultimately, also we were worried about how full on and intense this area looked in terms of color and everything. Ultimately, we decided to go for it, and we talked to Natalia, who was Beatriz's studio manager and assistant, and worked with her for a decade. And we were like, oh, are you okay with us doing this? Do you think Beatriz would be okay with us doing this? And she was like, yeah, go for it. It's absolutely fine. But
we were talking earlier about her kind of unpreciousness, about these, this is not just like a sacred work of art wallpaper. It's meant to be part of the fabric of an environment and played with, and the backdrop. And this is exactly the point that she's making. Also, the strategy of repetition, like to repeat these images again and again and again, and insist that we bear witness to them, that we don't look away, that they might become subsumed to our environment, that we might become desensitized to them. But she's asking us to look again and again at them. And I think this image, Plumario Colombiano, which is translated as Colombian featherwork, is images of previous Colombian presidents wearing indigenous headdresses at presidential addresses, so making speeches and avowing their commitment to indigenous communities and peoples, and yet obviously the regimes that they were running and their actions were directly impacting indigenous communities, displacing people. And the hypocrisy of that is just brought to light so brilliantly in this work.
Isn't the design also, doesn't include the indio amazónico?
Yes, and the
Which is
shamanic
like
healer,
this kind of shop you go to on the La Caracas in Bogotá, isn't it? Indio amazónico. You go and get your remedies. Yes. But it's the way it slips into wallpaper, and then you look again. That makes you look again. That does a service to the work of art, I think, the wallpaper. You start asking what you go in and look at these túmulos.
Yeah, but also the sculptures themselves,
Yeah.
about the kind of the super popular kind of ceramic forms that then has been painted on top, and then it becomes a kind of totemic figure, which is an irony, but at the same time is a celebration of indigenous culture or popular culture.
This is the monotheistic state, right? It claims to be a kind of pluralistic state. This is the totemic, all-powerful state, which tries to dress itself up in other guises, isn't it?
Unfortunately, I need to be cognizant of time, but this is exactly the point. Actually, my last question, Cecilia, you anticipated all my questions. You to all the questions I wanted to ask you beautifully. So, but the final point I wanted for us to reflect on, I think, is exactly this image and the intersection of the ancestral, the indigenous, and the state, and how she was representing this in her work. So thank you so much for this really wonderful conversation that we've had. Thank you everyone for being here. We'll open up for questions in a minute. But before we do so, as long as attention is high, I wanted to just alert everyone that Monday there is another Center for the Americas event, and it's going to be Charlene Villaseñor-Black, who just joined the University of Oxford's History of Art department from UCLA, and she's going to be talking about art and decolonizing love, visualizing just futures in the Chicanx civil rights movement. So please join us for that as well. But questions? Please.
Hello. Since we started, and from the moment I saw and I went into the exhibition, I was always wondering, like, was Beatriz part of this? Yes, no, was she aware of it? And when you guys said that she actually was part of the putting this together, but in this transitional stage when you guys didn't know when she was going. I am just very curious about the human experience of working with an artist that knows that is going to die very soon, because normally, I am not a curator, I know very little about it, but it's normally either the artist is gone or is life. But I am very curious about this transition when someone is about to go, and if you guys have found in that process anything where that was different from other experiences.
Thank you. Yeah, a really beautiful question and a difficult one to answer because it was a very moving experience, I think, for us to be working with her in this period, the kind of final period of her life. And when I first met her in 2024 and went to visit her, she was having some health issues, but she was still working in the studio 3 days a week. You know, she was 92, and she still had her studio manager with her for those days, and she was still making work. There was work in progress in the studio, and her memory was electric. You know, you could ask her about a particular year, a particular exhibition, and she would have all these incredible anecdotes. And we had this, charged conversation about feminism, and of course, she was struggling with her health at that point anyway. And then that, those challenges increased across the 2 years of making the exhibition. And I think one of the things that I always recount about her is that she said that she had achieved everything that she set out to do in her life, which I think, as a 93-year-old woman, to be able to say that, I just found so powerful and moving. And I hope when I'm 93 I can say the same thing. But I think it was just incredibly humbling to spend time with her. I mean, as everyone has alluded to, she was intimidating. She was a real, she was opinionated. She was a force of nature. But she also had a great generosity. I mean, she was a teacher. She ran this extraordinary pedagogical program called the Escuela de Guías in Bogota at the Museum of Modern Art from the 1970s onwards, and worked with young students. And that spirit of generosity and dialogue continued, right, to the last moments in which we were working with her. So yeah, it was very, very humbling and inspiring to kind of be with her in that final chapter.
You didn't expect her to die.
No. I mean, she was very ill, but you know, many people can live till 100, and you never know when someone. That's the strange thing about death. You never know when it's going to come. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the event and for the fascinating comments from everyone. I'm going to sound a tiny bit like a contrarian, just to provoke more debate, but I feel like I completely agree with Cecilia that Latin America, the label is a condition of visibility. But in the case of González, I mean, from what I've heard in the BBC, etc., it becomes again a condition of invisibility, of suffering, and blah blah blah, decolonization. And what for me she's doing brilliantly, and that's why she's an artist and not an activist. She's talking about the image. She's talking about color and what the image does and how the image produces affect. And she's like we should be talking about her as like taking her seriously as Adorno would have taken her, or as a theorist. And if he was Warhol, we would be talking about repetition. What you said about repetition, I love that, in her repetition takes a very particular effect, which is not trauma, but is exacerbation. No? I love that particular formalist comment in the talk. And I think in a way this is kind of, I want to see more thinking about this kind of Latin American art in kind of formalist terms, because there's so much to say about how much Latin Americans, from that foundational cosmopolitanism that we have and that is denied to us over and over, can theorize the effects of art and the image on our society, which then becomes so relevant in regard to everything that's happening with images. But anyway, but thank you. Everything adds. I don't want to.
All of the essays that these illustrious people have written in the catalogue address those questions really, really beautifully, I think. They're really, I found them hugely instructive.
I think worth saying that similar to what you said, and I think this was also why she was so resistant to these terms. And when she made Los Suicidas del Cisga, which has this, really tragic story of suicide behind it. She said she had no interest whatsoever in the story. What she was interested in was the image. What had happened. Yeah, what happened after an image was reproduced, and then that reproduction was reproduced, and then that reproduction of a reproduction was reproduced. And I think that's why I was talking about which I think artists at the time were interested in, what is a unique Latin American expression, not so much thinking about necessarily it is a mixture of identity politics, but also form. Like for her, she found the unique expression in the flatness, the deliberate clumsiness, the forms kind of, the bodies melding into one, the bold colors reflecting churches in her hometown and things like that. So I completely agree that often when we're talking about art from not the side, I don't know if you can even talk about center and periphery anymore, but often we talk about identity over and subject over form, and that's something that we should avoid.
I love that moment in the exhibition where the three paintings are put together. It's such a good, actually really wanted to include it in the review I wrote about it, and they can't remove it because it was too academic. But it's brilliant. It's one of these things that this exhibition is doing that no other exhibitions have done. Because each one of the versions has a different effect and politics, right? It's really...
And sorry, just to say one last thing, even beyond the image, she was also a painter. She loved painting, and in the late 80s, early 90s, she leaves enamel on metal and goes back to oil on canvas, and the centrality of that medium and the pleasure of painting with that medium. And for example, while this is talking about the indigenous condition, she also talked about how these are also experiments in trying to get burgundy, this vino tinto, to match with the color of water as well. And they asked, why did you paint those curtains? And she was just for the pleasure of painting curtains. So it wasn't all about, but sorry.
I think there's irony in that comment as well.
Yeah.
But no, I think also, to kind of jump off what you were saying, Dave, I think we've talked about her so much as an amazing colorist. Her palette is completely extraordinary, and that's what's so seductive about the work. And actually one of the powerful strategies in her work. She uses these very bizarre, unusual colour juxtapositions, these glowing teals. We talked about this earlier as this symbol for grief, for loss, and she uses these strategies to kind of draw you in, and then you're kind of hit with actually what she's depicting. And a lot of these images are really violent, they're brutal, but they are portrayed with such kind of surreal poetry and kind of mythical palettes that she creates herself. Yeah.
Sorry, can you go ahead?
No, just to, I think that's, Mara's question is great. I think of it as a kind of economy or ecology of the image. Is it Susan Sontag says, we need a kind of economy of images because there are too many, but she looks at how they morph and circulate and return and change forms and matter, and it's really, I think it's about that. I mean, yes, there's the figurative, you put it beautifully, there's this sort of tightrope walk between figuration and abstraction, and on that tightrope walk there's something about this other kind of ecology, economy, I'm not quite sure which word to use, of images is woven as they circulate and morph, change into blocks of colour, come back, acquire a kind of social fingerprint. Something is about that, I think.
Yeah, but also for me, I mean, when I look at the Suicidas de Silvia, one of the conversations we had the other day when we met is the fact that she had a lot of concerns from the very beginning. If we wanted to reduce the work of Beatriz González to a cliche, we could do. She touches every single subject that is, haunted about Latin American violence, this and that. So when she says that the Suicidas de Silvia is about the flatness of the image, that sounds like almost like a Cold War sort of thing where you kind of separate form from content. And I don't think it was ever possible. I think you really need to see as a great innovator, as an artist, but at the same time, I mean, the work would be nothing unless there was this incredible tension with the subject matter. It was about a couple that was, suicide. I mean, she was aware that this is about a Christian subject. This is about this kind of piousness of a woman and so forth. So you can do a thread about women's issues, you can do a thread about political issues, social issues, corruption issues, whatever. But and then there is, is it completely inseparable?
You talk about this sort of inscription of, this reinscription of art history.
Yeah.
But there's also the reinscription of art in social life, and they are inseparable.
Yeah, and also, for me, I've reached a point in my life where I don't care anymore. Identity politics like a dirty word, but this is because every single thing that has a real potential value of rebuking the status quo, we say, so the system says it's disgusting.
Yeah.
Identity politics reductive is this and that, and then someone makes money with it, because then you get the petrol station, you have some sort of handicapped person say donate 5 cents to it. It's identity politics, and then when it's domesticated, it's reinserted back into the system, and we don't even want to see it. And in the meantime, we don't even know what happened to it.
La coprofagia that Marta Traba talked about.
Yeah, but
she's showing how it works.
Ultimately, she's provincial, but she's universal. She's political and she's not political. She's family, not family. The point is not to reduce something to one unique thing. Her work is not just about like tragedy, but there is, those images of these crying women, the sorrow. There's a universal image. There is no way of reducing that. That's her. It's just done in a way that is impossible to refute it. It's impossible to say, no, it's not going to touch me. And I think that was, I don't think the binary has to exist. It's either this is aesthetic or... I just find that that is a complicated way to be able to say that she's beyond Latin American because she's, her paintings are flat or they're not narrative. I just don't know. I just find that...
But I think Mara's question was about the need to address that other aspect, right? As artists.
No, I just feel like that is ultimately, I feel like when I was here, I was like, when I first came to Europe, the main question was like, or this separation between like form and content. It's something that as a young Latin American artist, I never experienced. I don't think if there is something that you could say is very Latin American in terms of what the artists have contributed is that our minimalism has always been eccentric and sexy. And, like it's like, even if it's always, there's never not been a coupling of the formal and the political.
That is exactly what I wanted to ask you about in terms of that idea of form versus substance.
Yeah.
And of course, you make the choice of abstraction, and I think that's a very important one. Also, if you want to stay with the formalist discussion, it's a very important one to think about.
I mean, I wouldn't say that my work is abstract, or, like I would
Like Beatriz, it's more complicated. It's
Yeah,
that type
but I
But
think
it's
there's-
abstract, but it's not abstract.
Yeah.
It's abstract, but not in the traditional sense that it's about something that is devoid of a relationship with reality.
Exactly.
It's still talking to the
And
world.
some of them are
with a lot-
diagrams, some of them are tabletop, some of them, in my case, I could argue that they're figurative, but I would be doing this just to be a contrarian. But what I'm saying is like, there is no separation. But there's also, I don't think it would
New
serve the work
parameters.
to speak to it only in formalistic terms.
Oh, no, but it's not only, generally content takes over.
Yeah,
And no one theorizes, like, very few people take Latin American art seriously to theorize.
Yeah.
The October group is not writing about Latin American art. So it's about like not either or. It's about how much content takes over, and then the BBC will only talk about the violence in Colombia and obscure the formal processes that are happening in the process. Right? That's the point. Not about either or. No.
This idea of, which I think is really powerful, this idea of using the lushness of the palette, the lushness of color to entice people to come to a place where she's also, where it's a contentious space, but also she allows you to stay there because she's not asking you to pick a side except the one that sort of deals with empathy and suffering.
Totally in solidarity.
Sí, señora.
Yeah, which is a place where you can actually stand comfortably because we can all feel it.
Yeah, we can all be moved.
Yeah.
Maybe we have time for one more question.
I
Or
don't
two.
think I need the microphone.
Recording. One or two. But then we have
I just wanted to say
drinks,
Thank you
so-
for such a panel. My question is around her self-portrait, because it seems so out of place with the rest of her practice, and that, it's very clear that in the shift of her painting within the 80s and 90s, that her palette is completely changing, images of grief become a lot more prevalent, and then she goes ahead and paints herself within this very clear image of grief. Throughout the panel, you've been discussing a lot whether or not she's a feminist, whether she thought she was a feminist or an activist, but this seems like such a clear activist choice to, for such a long time, she had to distance away from things and then to represent herself in that way. Just wondering if you could talk more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a really radical act of solidarity and empathy, that this work. I mean, it's very, very unusual, the third from the left, and it's very, very unusual in her practice. Like, there are almost no self-portraits. She did make a very strange death mask of herself, actually, which we didn't include in the show. It was kind of an experiment where she went to one of the sites near Ours Anonymous, near the public cemetery installation she made in 2007, 2009, and she went to one of the places where you can get a death mask made and had it made out of plaster, and they actually included it in the iteration of the show that was in Sao Paulo earlier last year. But anyway, so there's a moment of her kind of really sort of bringing her contending with her own mortality later in her life. But this work from 1997, I think, is this. I don't necessarily see it actually as an act of activism per se. I see it more as like her as a mother experiencing deep empathy. Like, this is a moment in, as Cecilia was explaining, that this military base was attacked. Many, many young men were killed, taken hostage, and all of the women were asked to kind of contend with these disappearances. The sisters, the wives, the mothers, the girlfriends, the partners. And she, I think, is almost pushed to the brink. She has to implicate herself. She has to stand like in their shoes. Her own son was conscripted to the military in 1985. Like, I think it's this just radical act of solidarity. That's how we've kind of framed it in the show.
This was the event of a major case against the Colombian state, because most of the soldiers it turned out had not had the adequate training. But do you remember this, Erna? 1996, in Putumayo. Where
Yeah, that was Putumayo. There was one before that, which was El Alto del Naira.
Yeah.
And that's when it was communicated and the soldiers just were not trained properly and didn't have proper equipment. They were just being sent to the jungle and just deal with it.
And it was all about the training. It was all about the young men, wasn't it? And that's something. The focusing on the mothers, sisters, grieving, I think that's something interesting.
That's one of the things that I found really extraordinary about this painting. I don't really know fully naked representation, so she made the most vulnerable possible expression of an individual is to have someone standing on a kind of a pedestal with the kind of curtains creating this kind of theater of this kind of lonely gesture of sorrow, and she's like almost like a dying body, but she's naked. I mean, there is no other woman is entirely naked. Some of them have the chest, it's bare, but they're always protected. So this is the most unprotected, this most radical of all representations.
Is there a quote about saying everything that is left is death?
Yeah, there is nothing left but death.
In fact, I mean, that color, it
Yes,
really
definitely.
shocks me because it really is the color of a corpse that has died a week ago, maybe.
Blue.
Blue. So, but that is the color. So I feel like it's her embodying that death, even the corpse in the morgues, which these mothers.
I had not even thought about that. That's very interesting. Yeah.
It's really chilling.
And I think the fact that she paints herself, thinking of formally about how she replicates the same kind of structure and format as the other women who are in these gestures of grief. It's like these women alone in these very personal experiences of grief are then brought together in collectivity. And as they did come together in the main square in Bogota, and she was seeing that, and she was remarking how she hadn't seen that before. This was the first time in the 90s where she saw women kind of actively protesting in Bogota about these disappearances. I was really struck by it, and it was the women who were reproduced again, and who were pictured again and again in the newspapers in these gestures of grief.
Would you say that to me this work stands alone almost, and maybe I'm wrong, I wonder if you agree, but there's always, even in the more painful works, there is always a degree of critical distance. She's always painting from a representation of violence, but this is one of the few instances where she's actually kind of implicating herself as well, inserting herself in these histories, which I think she was always careful not to do, but I wonder if you agree.
Yeah, totally. Strategy,
Collapsing the distance.
And the immersive line of sight in the later paintings is right under the water, isn't it? It's in those subcurrents.
Yeah.
Should we do just
person
one
over there that wanted to?
Would you like wine?
One more question and then we drink.
And then, we can.
And then we drink.
Thank you so much for your time today. One thing that's really been emphasized is this reproduction image and the flattening of the original, and I wondered if you could provide a bit more insight about the thought process behind including reproductions of her own work, particularly the final room and the frieze down the corridor, and whether you expected the audience to engage with it differently.
So those are actually artworks themselves that she made. So it's very interesting that her interest in repetition extends to the materiality and the format of the work. So the Zócalo del Duelo that we see here was made in 2018, which was 2 years after the peace treaty was signed in Colombia. And it's this extraordinary kind of very graphic motif of these two women in gestures of grief, one with her mobile phone, almost as if she's waiting for the news. And Beatriz talked about how she made this work to kind of draw attention to the fact that despite the peace treaty, grief and loss and mourning was still very much part of everyone's everyday lives. Just because a peace treaty had been signed didn't mean the violence and grief had ended. But this was actually made as a fly poster. So this is our kind of replication of the work, which she also installed in her exhibitions, but originally the work was actually fly posted, like, concert or gig posters around the streets of Bogota. There's these amazing photographs of it being put up, right next to adverts for theatre performances and concerts, and like really becoming part of the fabric of the city. And the final room in the exhibition, Auris Anonymous, she actually made this work specifically. It's called A Posteriori. It's a wallpaper installation that she made for Fragmentos, which is a space in Bogota, which is run by Doris Salcedo, a great friend and artist, a great friend of Beatriz. And it was her way of kind of like I guess it's like an installation version of the cemetery work. And so it provided us with this beautiful way of bringing the cemetery to London. How do we translate this extraordinary project that you feel can only be experienced kind of in situ, this collective kind of sacred space for mourning? How do you translate that? And she's done that for us. She's given us a gift.
That particular work, I said the other day, its aim is it's a disruption of the flattening that happens next door in the creation of this monument, which was built over a popular cemetery. In the imposition of this narrative that there was Guerra Civil in Colombia from 1965 to now, there was a complete erasure of everything that happened before. This monument was built on a site where the poor, nameless victims from the previous conflicts. She doesn't buy this stagist idea of conflicts, there are continuities. So it's a disruption of a flattening, I think.
And
Of
she
a
thought
social
that,
flattening, of a
she thought that
memory
the work
flattening.
could save the site.
Yeah. The best way to save the site once you become an established artist is paint on it. No one's gonna knock it down because it's artistic heritage.
But they have tried many times to knock
They've
it
tried
down.
many times.
And they tried, yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for this wonderful conversation, and thank you for being such an attentive audience.